A lot of the thinking going back was that sometime in late summer, the economy will just completely implode. Could you have a completely failed economy, yet the government is still able to keep its thumb on the Cuban people, literally as they're starving to death? That's a distinct possibility. The country that kind of kept them afloat was Venezuela. That oil is not going to Cuba, and hence Cuba is in such dire straits. I've seen just how desperate the Cuban people are to get away from that regime, and it makes it very clear just how bad that political economic system is. The Castro family has been essentially the royal family of the Cuban Revolution since 1959. They have controlled the whole thing. They still call the shots. And I would imagine that they're going to offer them some sort of real estate deal. We've already heard a rumor that they were planning on offering them, some sort of real estate deal to the Trump family or to President Trump personally to kind of sweeten the deal. Hal Kempfer, retired U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, lieutenant colonel. I have a firm, Global Risk Intelligence and Planning. I'm the CEO of the firm. I have the STRAT podcast, which stands for Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, and I do national security analysis consulting and homeland security consulting and analysis. How long will the economy hold out? A lot of the thinking going back probably till May was that sometime in late summer, and we're getting very close to that, the economy will just completely implode. Now, the question is, within Cuban society, with its huge security apparatus, its security forces, this very ingrained and rather well-functioning government apparatus, how would that collapse manifest itself? Could you have a completely failed economy, yet the government is still able to keep its thumb on the Cuban people, literally as they're starving to death or whatever other harm is coming to all of them? That's a distinct possibility. So this thing could drag out well into the fall. Now, Cuba has passed a series of reforms, I think 175 different line items in legislation, which ostensibly is called to privatize a lot of the Cuban economy. Most have looked at it and say, well, that's too little too late. And the U.S.'s response to that was to immediately impose sanctions, to include sanctions on one of the key banks, which is essential for that privatization to occur. So in one way, you could say Cuba's going the right direction in getting away from this totalitarian command economy model, which has completely failed to privatized. But I kind of look at this, and in the back of my mind's drifting back to 1989, 90, 91 in the Soviet Union, when some of the reforms under Gorbachev were being instituted. But by that time, the collapse of that entire socioeconomic system was, now, we didn't know it then, but now we can clearly see was too far gone. There wasn't really any reform they could do under that system that would have saved it. Interesting, President Trump is a former real estate tycoon or whatever, real estate businessman. And I would say 3 reasons why Cuba can't be saved by China and Russia, and certainly not by North Korea. Location, location, location. They're in the wrong place. They're in the Caribbean. They're just off the coast of Florida, 90 miles. They're in the wrong location. China can't get there easily. Russia theoretically could get there a little easier, but not much. And Russia right now has huge problems with its war with Ukraine, the devastation of Ukrainian deep strikes on its critical infrastructure, particularly its oil and gas capabilities, its difficulty in moving ships around the world and planes around the world. So Russia it's definitely not the Soviet Union, and it just doesn't have a lot of resources. And then I would point out that China is a Pacific power. Certainly they have portents of being a global power, and they are making inroads around the world, but they're just in the wrong place to provide a lot of heavy duty, heavy lift assistance to Cuba. And I'm not sure that in China's calculus, Cuba really matters that much. It's not absolutely vital that Cuba's there. And then North Korea, well, that economy's flat anyway, and there's not really much they can do. And at that point, you run out of allies. The country that kind of kept them afloat by importing cheap oil or exporting cheap oil to them was Venezuela. And the U.S. basically controls what Venezuela exports in terms of oil. That oil is not going to Cuba, and hence Cuba is in such dire straits. And by the way, we put a lot of pressure. Mexico started stepping up initially to export oil to Cuba, and we put a lot of pressure on Mexico. And so a lot of these other countries around the Caribbean, Central South America, Mexico, South the U.S., that they have pulled back on lending a lifeline to Cuba. I also think the other reason is that certainly from a regional perspective between North and South America, everyone recognizes that a post-Castro, post-communist Cuba would be good for the region. It would be good for the Cuban people. What we've seen over the decades, and I was stationed in the military in Central America during the 94 Boatlift crisis when Cubans and Haitians were risking their lives on flimsy watercraft to escape to the United States just to get away from the horrific situation at home. I was right there at the Panama Canal. We had a big Cuban refugee camp set up there in the Panama Canal. I'd been to that refugee camp, was working a project where that was part of one of the things we were looking at, or one of the things we were managing overall. And so I've seen just how desperate the Cuban people are to get away from that regime. And it makes it very clear just how bad that political economic system is. It's repressive. It's not functioning. Even their famous health system, which has been lauded so much, is why can't the U.S. have a system like that? That health system is completely broken down now. It doesn't function. Well, it's certainly something we can always, threaten to do, which obviously the president did threaten potential military action there. President Trump does have a proclivity to go out there and threaten kinetic action at times. You may recall that when it appeared that Oman, when Iran said we're going to make a deal with Oman to control the Strait of Hormuz, President Trump made a side comment about, well, we might bomb Oman. Now, Oman's been a staunch U.S. ally for decades and decades. We have a very close relationship with them. So obviously that didn't go over too well. And so the president does say some things like that. Threatening kinetic action doesn't mean he won't do it. And we've certainly seen that he's not reticent to employ kinetic action. But I think the reality of Cuba is to what end? Why would we need to do this? And I find rather interesting that the head of U.S. Southern Command, which is responsible for Cuba, South America, Central America, lots of the Caribbean, that the head of U.S. Southern Command was actually meeting with senior Cuban military and security officials right at the line of Guantanamo, our naval base down there, and discussing, as far as I can tell, the what if scenario, which is what if the government falls apart? What if, and kind of as localized, which is what's going to happen in and around Guantanamo. That's something that we're very concerned about. But also making that personal connection, recognizing that the government in Havana might fall, and there might be a rather chaotic period of transition that occurs there. So I think what the U.S. is doing is actually kind of getting ready for the collapse and the chaos, and stepping in that regard, which really gets into civil military, all the levers of the U.S. government, and probably working with some of our allies in the region and elsewhere around the world to come in and do what is essentially, obviously, some sort of security mission to stop anarchy and deadly violence on the streets and throughout Cuba. But the other part would be a humanitarian assistance mission to help the Cuban people and to help them move to the next chapter. Now, one of the issues in the U.S., and this is going to come out of, and certainly it's an issue that would resonate elsewhere with our allies around the world, to include Great Britain and certainly other countries in Europe that were involved in the war on terror, Afghanistan and Iraq, is if we're going into Cuba, and if the mission is nation building, which I could quickly see that being a term that would be affixed to what our mission is there will be some political resistance to that because of our experiences over the last 25 years. We saw what happened in Afghanistan, where our mission went in to stop Al-Qaeda, and then it kind of transitioned into nation building and all these other things. And of course, that over 20 years, that did not end well. It did not end well at all. And so that's going to be very much in the political memory of everyone if we're going to Cuba. Although I would say Cuba is definitely not Afghanistan. It is a completely different country. It's a different, obviously geographically different, but it's a different social system, different value system across the population, just a very different country indeed. You know, what's interesting is the Castro family, and this does happen, particularly in some communist countries, as much as they, if you're a student of Marx and Engels and, you study, the political systems, and certainly during the Cold War, we would all study Marx and Engels because we had to understand the ideology of our opponent. That it's always interesting to see that there are these, political families that essentially take over. The Kim family in North Korea, well, that is essentially the Hermit Kingdom. It has stayed in the same family. It is a monarchy in every way, shape, and form except for being called a monarchy. The Castro family has been essentially the royal family of the Cuban Revolution since 1959. They have controlled the whole thing, and they still, even though the president is not a member of the Castro family per se, they still call the shots, and they still are the ones that control all the levers of power. And I just find that kind of interesting. That is a dynamic that is within this system, that it will be displacing the Castro family. And I find it rather interesting that some of the entrees to the West, for example, the recent one where, the grandson, Raul Castro, the grandson, who has been kind of in the shadows, all of a sudden pops up. He's sitting at his, grandfather's desk. He's kind of pretending himself to be speaking on behalf of the government, says he wants to negotiate with President Trump. But if you look at the line and block chart, you go, who is this guy? Where does he come from that he can do this? And basically what he touts is his lineage, that he comes from the Castro family. So I do find that rather interesting. It's a little bit different dynamic, although we've certainly saw it with the Assad family in Syria, the same thing. The Ceausescu, he basically controlled everything in Romania forever. And we've seen it with other totalitarian systems that they're built around a family or a dictator that stays around for decades and decades. Well, within Cuba, there's a great deal of corruption. Obviously, it's a controlled system, so you don't see any public investigations of the Castro family on all the things that they've usurped and taken and kept over the many, many years. You won't see that. But what you might see is, and this would deal with the Cuban intelligence apparatus. They have a very advanced intelligence system. They have one primary target, which is the United States. That's really the country that they've been looking at forever and ever. It's what they've been focused upon. They have done some rather extensive intelligence operations, penetrations of our government in the past. And so they're going to be basically building a profile, if you will, of not only President Trump, but those around President Trump. And they're going to try and figure out what type of deals can they offer them. And I would imagine that they're going to offer them some sort of real estate deal. We've already heard a rumor that they were planning on offering them, some sort of real estate deal to the Trump family or to President Trump personally to kind of sweeten the deal, sweeten the negotiations or something like that. So I would imagine they're going to try and do that. That may be a mistake on their end. I'd like to think that the U.S., our institutional checks and balances would prevent something like that from happening. But you would definitely try. You would see them try. I don't expect that they won't make some effort to do something like that behind the scenes. And if they do, I would kind of wonder what the ramifications of that would be within the U.S. system if some sort of deal like that was struck. I'm kind of wondering if there won't be a point where people just say, that's it, I've had enough. That kind of happened over in Iran back in January and December, where they went to the streets. And the only response by the Iranian regime, using its besieged militia and its Revolutionary Guard Corps, was to literally mow down people in the streets. And it's estimated they killed over 40,000. If you go back to Tiananmen Square back in 1989. If you go back to what was happening in Eastern Europe, 89 and 90, you saw some very draconian action by these authoritarian, security-focused state apparatus where they were basically cracking down on the people. Eventually, we kind of look at that and we say, well, the people eventually won, but it wasn't after a lot of carnage had taken place. By the way, in China, the people did not win. The security apparatus basically mowed them down, literally ran over them with tanks. So it doesn't always go the way you'd hope it would go. I don't know what would happen in Cuba, but I would say the backdrop is that the Cuban system, the political, it is an island. All right. There is no other connection to the outside. So whatever happens there, if the Cuban government cannot provide the basic essentials for the Cuban people, and it is a totalitarian system, at some point, you're going to see people going outside on the streets and doing a lot more than just banging pans. And then my question will be, what will the military do? Little less, the security apparatus, that's a different thing. But if you look at the local law enforcement, if you look at the military per se, those are institutions whose membership come from the Cuban people. I'm not saying the security apparatus folks don't either, but I'm just saying there's a connection there. And some of them will probably do what so many other militaries around the world have done when they get these orders to, basically turn their guns on their own people. They may not, and they may turn around and join the people to overthrow the government, particularly if the perception is throughout these institutions, the military institutions, that the Cuban government is destined to fall. There is nothing to be gained, and certainly if the officers themselves feel that if to do so will only end up getting them into, there'll be serious ramifications for what happens if they obey those orders. At that point, you might see a big shift.